Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Eigo. Thank you for joining us here today when we continue our lesson on how to use verbs in English. So, last week, we talked about intransitive verbs. Do you remember? So, intransitive verbs are pretty simple because they are verbs that don't need an object. So, that means you could probably make an English sentence using just two words. For example, I read. So although that's possible grammatically, we almost never use a two-word sentence, but sometimes, usually we'll put other stuff at the end. For example, we might say, I read every day. So the I read is the subject and the intransitive verb. So today it becomes a little bit more difficult, a little bit more complex, because we will be talking about transitive verbs. Okay, so transitive verbs. That's the subject for today, or the topic, I should say. Transitive verbs. Just as intransitive verbs don't need or don't have an object, a direct object, transitive verbs always have a direct object. In this lesson, I'll be representing direct object maybe like this or something similar in case I forgot. Okay, so direct object. So the direct object is a person or a thing that receives the action of the transitive verb. So, for example, let's look at an example sentence. For example, we need more money. We need more money. So if you ask the question, what do you need? And the answer is more money. So that means more money is the direct object of the transitive verb need. Okay, we need more money. Read, we can do that with read too, because read, I read every day, that's intransitive. But if you put a direct object on it, it becomes transitive. For example, I read a book every day. So the book receives the action of reading. So it's very important. If a verb has a direct object, it's a transitive verb. Very important to remember. So why don't we look at a couple of examples of transitive verbs so we can get a feel of how we should use them. All right. So the transitive verb, as I just told you, consists of a subject, a transitive verb, an object, and other stuff. And that object, of course, is direct object. So notice the grouping. This time, from this week, I'm using some brackets to indicate grouping because it's such an important concept to become a fluent English speaker. So we have this subject, transitive verb, object grouped together, and then other stuff. Subject, transitive verb, object, and other stuff. As I told you, transitive verb always needs an object, so the verb and object must be together. As I told you last week, the subject and verb must be together. So when using a transitive verb, you have to say subject, transitive verb, object as one group. Then you can say other stuff. I know this is hard, and especially if you are educated in the Japanese school system, which puts a stress on learning vocabulary, where you learn one word by one word. The important point to remember is that if you can master grouping, number one, it will help you select the correct word and expression more easily. And also, it'll make your English sound very, very fluent. And since native speakers always talk with this kind of grouping, you might be able to even improve your hearing ability when native speakers speak to you. So let's look at these example sentences and listen to how I group this. I'll read it very slowly first and put a clear break between the object and the other part. Now, as I always say, you don't need to make a big stop like this. I'm just showing you this to show you where you can stop. All right, let's listen to the first sentence. This doesn't have others, so we'll read this straight through. We need more money. You got that? We need more money. Keep all of this together. Don't say, we need, so a native speaker knows need is a transitive verb. So if you say, we need, there's waiting. Well, we need what, need what, need what? What's the object? So we need more money. You got to keep that together. Okay, the second sentence, please listen. My mother made cookies last night. My mother made cookies last night. Number 3, the student sent her resume to the company. The student sent her resume to the company. Look at the fourth one. I took off my shoes at the door. I took off my shoes at the door. The scientists, I skipped one. Let's go back. We have turkey on Thanksgiving. We have turkey on Thanksgiving. And the last one, the scientists created a new material. The scientists created a new material. Okay, now that has a pretty dramatic break between object and other. Let me read these one more time. And in this case, I'll read them straight through. And I'll read them pretty quickly, not really fast, but pretty quickly. And as I do, I want you to try to catch the separation between the object and other. I will separate. I won't pause as long as I did. But my intonation or my phrasing or my rhythm you should be able to catch a separation between object and other using one of those techniques. Okay, let's listen. Or please, you can repeat if you like. We need more money. We need more money. Next one. My mother made cookies last night. My mother made cookies last night. The student sent her resume to the company. The student sent her resume to the company. I took off my shoes at the door. I took off my shoes at the door. We have turkey on Thanksgiving. We have turkey on Thanksgiving. The scientists created a new material. Okay, one more thing about grouping. I don't want to stay on this topic a long time, but it is so important. If you notice my intonation, the subject, we, and the direct object, for example, the second one, the subject, my mother, and the direct object, cookies, I do a little bit higher intonation. And that's because these are the most important words. Okay, for example, the second sentence, my mother made cookies last night. Mother, cookies last night. You got that? So that is how you do your grouping. We'll get into that in more detail in future lessons. I think I'm going to do a special lesson on grouping eventually after we have the tools to handle it. Okay, now those are your transitive verbs. All right. Now let's come back to our whiteboard here. And in the next step, I would like to tell you about another type of transitive verb, and this is called a ditransitive verb. Okay? Another way to say this is a bitransitive verb. Okay? Sorry about that running off the edge there, but it's a little bit hard for me to get this. Let's go back here. All right, and I'll put it down here. Bitransitive verb. Now, if you are an English speaker who is rather advanced, you might know that die and by both mean two. Okay? Both by and die means two. From what I can see on the internet, maybe die is the most popular word, but I have seen also by. So what is a ditransitive verb? Well, as you might imagine, a ditransitive verb has two objects. Okay? Two objects. Sounds a little bit difficult, but it's not as difficult as it sounds at this point. It does get difficult later, but at this point, it's not so difficult. So, two objects. One object is a direct object. And the other object is an indirect object. Okay? So, as I told you before, a direct object is an object that receives the action of the transitive verb. So, for example, you could say, I read a book. So, the book receives the action read, so book is the direct object. So, but if you say, I read her a book, her is the indirect object. I read something for her benefit. Okay? So that's the indirect object. So a bitransitive verb has two objects, one direct object and one indirect object. Let's go back to our examples and you can see what I'm talking about here, I think. So a ditransitive verb, like I just told you, subject, ditransitive verb, indirect object first, then direct object. Now this may look a little funny because, as I told you before, a transitive verb has a direct object that has to be connected to the verb. But in this pattern, the direct object is separated and the indirect object is put inside. Also, notice that the grouping is different. You have the subject, ditransitive verb, indirect object, must be grouped together. And then you have the direct object added at the end. So you can pause between the indirect object and the direct object. So this is something that you should remember if you are studying conversation. And keeping these words together is grouped together is very, very important. Now, listen to me as I read these example sentences, and I'll pause between the indirect object and the direct object. Please listen, and you can repeat if you like. Jane sent Edward a message. Jane sent Edward a message. The clerk gave me my receipt. The clerk gave me my receipt. The father read the girl a bedtime story. The father read the girl a bedtime story. I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question. Jack loaned me his car. Jack loaned me his car. The girl showed me her new doll. The girl showed me her new doll. Once again, I made a big pause, and that's just to show you that it's possible to pause there. You don't have to pause there, but it's just possible to do so. So let me read these at a higher speed. Please listen again to the intonation. Listen how I make a high intonation at the important words. Listen again to my pace or my rhythm, how I separate the indirect object and the direct object, even though I may not pause dramatically like I did just now. So listen again to these examples. Jane sent Edward a message. Jane sent Edward a message. The clerk gave me my receipt. The clerk gave me my receipt. The father read the girl a bedtime story. The father read the girl a bedtime story. I wanted to ask you a question. I wanted to ask you a question. Jack loaned me his car. Jack loaned me his car. The girl showed me her new doll. The girl showed me her new doll. Could you catch it? Could you catch that separation? If you could, then you're well on the way to becoming an advanced English speaker. All right, that's very, very important about ditransitive verbs. one more point about ditransitive verbs that I want you to remember, that ditransitive verbs and even some intransitive verbs can be used in what we call the preposition style or preposition structure. Now, I'm not going to try to write the preposition structure. It's pretty long, but I'll give you some examples soon, but you have to try to remember that the preposition structure uses a prepositional phrase for the indirect object. Actually, with a prepositional phrase, it eliminates, there is no indirect object. So what you'll have is like a transitive verb plus prepositional phrase. The problem is, not all ditransitive verbs can be used in the prepositional structure. Some can, some cannot. So it's very, very confusing in that regard. And there's no rule. I can't say, oh, always do this, always do that. It's something you just have to get used to and learn with experience and practice. So as you listen to native speakers, try to catch how they're using their transitive verbs and transitive verbs. Look, I keep getting my tongue twisted. And try to hear what they're doing. You can do this by listening to people in person or on YouTube or on Netflix or on Amazon Prime or something like that. Watch plenty of movies and then you'll get used to it. What you have to remember is that you have a sorry, I'm having a hard time here. Okay, my pen is not working for some reason, so we'll just go on to the examples. Let's transition over to the examples. Here is the preposition structure. So you have a subject, you have a verb, you have your direct object, and as with a transitive verb, these are grouped together. You have to keep these together. And then you have a prepositional phrase. Now, a prepositional phrase is a group of words that start with a preposition, like to or for or something like that. To and for are the two prepositions used in this this table of examples. So let me read them. I'll read them again, making a big pause after the direct object, just to give you some example of how they should sound. Please listen. Jane sent a message to Edward. The clerk gave my receipt to me. The father read a bedtime story to the girl. Jack loaned his car to me. He bought a drink for her. The girl showed her new doll to me. You got that? So now I'll read them at a quicker speed. I'll eliminate the dramatic break. Listen to the intonation, listen to the phrasing, and try to catch the separation between the direct object and the prepositional phrase. Jane sent a message to Edward. The clerk gave my receipt to me. The father read a bedtime The father read a bedtime story to the girl. Jack loaned his car to me. He bought a drink for her. The girl showed her new doll to me. Could you catch it? Could you catch that break there? All right. So actually, that's about it for these different kinds of transitive and bitransitive verbs. The thing to remember mostly is the grouping that we learned here now as to what verb can be used how. It's very difficult, I think it's impossible to give you a strict definition. With this verb, always do that. With this kind of verb, always do this. So what we'll do is I'll put together some lists, practice lists, where I'll read through some common transitive and ditransitive and prepositional structure kind of verbs so you can get used to hearing them. And we'll just drill you on these again and again and again, and I hope that will help you. Once again, I don't know when I'll be able to put up those different those different drills, but it will be in the relatively near future. Thing to remember, some verbs are only transitive. Some verbs are only intransitive. Some verbs are both transitive and intransitive. So good luck. And like I said, keep your ears open. You know, when I'm teaching you, try to listen. Oh, yeah, I saw how he used that. Oh, that's pretty good. Watch the intonation. Be very aware of how native speakers group and how they use intonation to make their separations. From next week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be paying close attention to my regular English classes that I teach during the week, and I'll be looking for mistakes that students generally make, that a lot of Japanese students make. And what we'll do is we'll cover 1-point lessons on mistakes that Japanese students often make when learning English, and I hope that will help you improve your English. We'll be talking about this subject, verb, other structure, which is very, very important. And we'll be talking about grouping, which is also very important, and try to help you use the English that you already know. You've already learned it in school, and we'll teach you how to learn it, how to use it to become a fluent and smooth speaker of English. Okay? So I'll see you again next week.